Can you imagine a 17-year-old black teenager walking into a courtroom? Not as a defendant, not as a witness, but as his own mother's legal defense, armed with nothing more than a worn-out briefcase, an oversized blazer, and an unshakable sense of justice. The moment Jordan Carter stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the courtroom changed. The hum of quiet whispers died down, replaced by sharp glances and muted murmurs. Every eye turned toward him, and every thought seemed to question his presence. What is this kid doing here? Is this a joke? But Jordan didn't flinch. The courtroom itself was intimidating, bathed in cold, clinical light that bounced off polished wooden benches and cast sharp shadows across tense faces. Seated above all, presiding with a familiar air of authority and icy detachment, was Judge Reynolds, a man known for his stern demeanor and little patience for nonsense. His eyes scanned the room, piercing and cold, until they landed on Jordan. With a faint smirk, he leaned forward and spoke words that cut deeper than silence. "This isn't the gymnasium. Are you sure you're not lost on your way to basketball practice?" The room erupted with soft, knowing laughter, led, of course, by Franklin Moore, the landlord's attorney, whose arrogant smirk painted him as a man who'd already decided the case was won. But Jordan held his ground. He straightened his back, lifted his chin, and looked Judge Reynolds directly in the eye. His voice, though youthful, was clear and steady. "No, Your Honor, I'm here to defend my mother." Those words echoed through the room like a pin drop in a storm. Laughter ceased. Glances shifted from amused to astonished. For a brief, hanging moment, time seemed suspended, every breath held, every heart beating a little louder. But what brought Jordan to this point? What kind of life experiences drive a teenager, with no legal background, to walk into a courtroom ready to challenge the system? To understand, you must go back to the cracked streets and weathered houses of a forgotten neighborhood, where Jordan and his mother Angela lived hand to mouth. Angela worked tirelessly as a cleaner, taking every shift she could find to afford the rent and keep food on the table. Their house was small, peeling paint, a leaky faucet, but it was filled with warmth, resilience, and dreams that refused to die. Angela always told Jordan that education was his key out, his weapon against the cycle that trapped families like theirs. Then came the letter, folded, shoved under the door like a thief in the night. Angela, drenched in sweat after another long day of work, unfolded it and read the words that made her knees weak: an eviction notice. Her voice trembled as she said, "They're saying I owe back rent. But I've paid. I know I've paid." Jordan, seated at the kitchen table, immediately sensed something was wrong. He stood, took the letter, and scanned it with furrowed brows. "Mom," he said, "this doesn't add up." Angela sank into a chair, her hands shaking as if all her strength had been stolen by ink on paper. Her voice was low, tired, almost broken. "You don't understand, Jordan. People like us don't win. They'll find a way to take everything, no matter what we do." And in that moment, watching his mother, his hero, crumble under the weight of injustice, something lit inside of him. It wasn't just anger, it was resolve. Jordan gripped the paper tighter, feeling every fiber of his being ignite with purpose. If no one else would fight for them, then he would. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he couldn't let the system crush them. That evening, Jordan sat quietly, the eviction notice still clenched in his hand, listening to his mother's slow footsteps echo around the house. He couldn't forget the way her hands had trembled, the way her voice had cracked, the way her spirit had faltered. So when he finally sat beside her on the couch, he didn't speak with fear, he spoke with determination. "We can't just let this happen," he said softly. "You've done everything for me. Now it's my turn." Angela shook her head slowly. Exhaustion wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. "Jordan, you're just a boy. They have lawyers, contracts, power. We can't fight that." But Jordan looked her in the eyes and asked the question that would change everything. "What if I did it? What if I represented you?" Shock flashed across Angela's face. "That's impossible," she said, barely breathing. "You don't know the law." "Then I'll learn," Jordan replied, his voice unwavering. "You told me to never give up. I can't sit here and let them take our home. I have to try." And that night, as Angela finally gave him her blessing through quiet tears and trembling hands, Jordan opened his laptop, searched tenant rights and eviction law, and began his journey, not just to save a home, but to challenge a system and become something no one expected him to be, a force for justice. The moment Jordan made the decision to fight back, everything changed. What had once been a simple kitchen table used for homework and family meals was transformed into a war room, a makeshift law office filled with borrowed legal books, handwritten notes, and printouts of tenant protection laws. The dim light above flickered occasionally, casting shifting shadows on the walls. But Jordan barely noticed. He was consumed, his eyes scanning each word like it was a map leading him and his mother back to safety. The eviction notice sat pinned to the wall in front of him, a constant, grim reminder of the battle they faced. Angela would watch from the doorway sometimes, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and worry. She saw her son's slumped shoulders, his tired eyes, his relentless focus, and wondered if she had asked too much of him. But she never told him to stop. One evening, she lingered longer than usual, her gaze resting on the boy she raised, now consumed by something far bigger than either of them had ever imagined. "Jordan," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm, "you don't have to do this alone. You've already done so much." He looked up, eyes bleary but unwavering. "Mom, if I don't, who will?" That simple answer carried a weight far beyond his years. Jordan knew the landlord's team expected him to give up, like so many others before. But this time, he was determined to prove them wrong. Late one night, flipping through a guide on housing rights, a phrase stopped him cold. All eviction notices must be notarized by a valid practicing notary public to be legally enforceable. His eyes darted to the document on the wall. Grabbing it, he scanned the bottom where the signature lay. Something about it didn't feel right. He quickly typed the notary's name into his laptop, fingers trembling. An hour of relentless digging revealed the truth. The notary listed had retired 2 years before the notice was dated. Jordan sat back, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. This wasn't just a clerical error, it was fraud. He felt a surge of energy, his exhaustion erased by the possibility that this could be their breakthrough. But he also knew that this discovery meant nothing unless he could use it strategically in court. He had to build a case that could stand against seasoned professionals. And that meant preparing like one. In the days that followed, Jordan became a different person, more focused, more intense, more driven. He practiced his arguments in front of a mirror, speaking aloud with growing confidence, adjusting his tone, pacing, and posture. He imagined every objection, every insult, every attempt to undermine him, and he counted each one. His oversized blazer hung nearby, waiting like armor for the battle ahead. Sometimes Angela would sit quietly in the corner, a smile playing at her lips as she watched him rehearse. One evening, she sat beside him as he flipped through his growing stack of notes. She placed her hand gently on his. "Jordan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "no matter what happens in that courtroom, I want you to know I'm proud of you. You've already done more than I ever dreamed possible." Jordan met her gaze, his voice softer now, but full of conviction. "I'm not just doing this for us," he said. "If they get away with this, they'll do it to someone else. I have to make it stop." That night, the table was covered with neatly arranged documents. Angela placed a plate of food beside him, urging him to eat, but he barely glanced up. "Thanks, Mom," he said, then turned back to his notes. Angela watched him for a moment longer, the weight in her chest equal parts pride and fear. She knew they were walking a tightrope, against a system built to protect the powerful. Yet for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. As the sky darkened and the hours slipped away, Jordan remained at the table, eyes darting across the page, lips whispering legal definitions and statutes to himself like sacred verses. Each word, each paragraph, felt like a weapon in his arsenal. He knew he wasn't just defending a home, He was defending dignity, memory, love. And as Angela finally went to sleep, the old refrigerator buzzing softly in the background, Jordan whispered to himself the promise that had taken root in his heart: I won't let them win. When morning came, he stood outside the courthouse, his binder clutched tightly to his chest, the blazer awkwardly draped over his slim frame. He took a breath and stepped forward, not as a scared boy, but as a defender of truth. He knew the eyes inside that room would doubt him, laugh at him, belittle him, but he was ready. Behind every page he studied, behind every statute he memorized, stood his mother's sacrifice, their home, and a voice that deserved to be heard. Jordan wasn't just walking into a courtroom, he was stepping into history. Jordan Carter stood at the defense table, binder open before him, his heart pounding but his voice steady, dressed in his oversized blazer and gripping the edge of the table. He stared down the courtroom that had laughed at him days earlier. Now, the air was still, heavy with anticipation. Your Honor, he began, his tone firm, I am here to prove that my family's eviction was not only unjust but also in violation of the law. As he continued, laying out the timeline, his words came more naturally, each sentence drawing from nights of relentless study. The courtroom, once dismissive, began to lean in, listening. Franklin Moore, the opposing attorney with his crisp suit and confident sneer, interrupted with a smirk audible in his voice, ridiculing Jordan's inexperience with jabs about YouTube and Google. The room chuckled, but Jordan stood firm. I didn't learn this from YouTube, he said calmly. I learned it by studying the same laws that are supposed to protect us all. Moore's smirk twitched. The judge leaned forward, interest peaked. Jordan opened his binder and walked the court through the events step by step, the eviction notice, the dates, the requirements, and finally, the revelation. The notary who had supposedly signed the document had retired 2 years before it was issued. He presented the facts methodically, linking the evidence to the legal violations, showing not only his understanding of the law but his command over it. The audience began to shift. Even those who had mocked him now watched with quiet respect. But Moore wasn't ready to concede. Rising from his seat, he moved with polished confidence, flipping open a law book and reading aloud with theatrical flair. He cited Section 45 of the Landlord-Tenant Act, stating a landlord has the right to evict if rent hasn't been paid for 2 consecutive months. Are you denying your mother was behind on payments? Moore challenged, trying to trap Jordan in a legal corner. Jordan didn't hesitate. I'm not here to deny the delays, he responded, but I am here to prove that the eviction notice itself is invalid due to fraud, making the entire process unlawful. Holding up the notice for all to see, he pointed again to the notary's signature, clear, indisputable proof of misconduct. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Moore glanced at the paper, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. Still, he pushed back, invoking Section 52 of the same act, claiming that procedural errors don't invalidate an eviction if the tenant failed to pay. Jordan responded instantly, acknowledging the clause but clarifying that such leniency only applies if the notice was valid in the first place. This is not a clerical error, he explained. This is a fraudulent document, and under state law, that voids the eviction entirely. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Moore's posture stiffened as he returned to his seat, defeated but unwilling to show it. The judge, who had watched the entire exchange with growing intrigue, finally leaned forward. His tone was more serious now, more curious. Mr. Carter, he began, these are serious accusations. If this evidence is verified, it could fundamentally alter this case. With a swift bang of the gavel, Judge Reynolds called for a brief recess to authenticate the documents. As he exited the courtroom, the tension shifted. Jordan let out a breath, shoulders relaxing slightly. He turned and caught his mother's eye. Angela sat behind him, tears glistening, her expression filled with pride and relief. She gave him a subtle nod, her silent way of saying, I see you. In that moment, Jordan felt something new, not fear, not pressure, but validation. Everything he had studied, all the late nights and quiet tears, had led to this moment of recognition. The judge returned after the break, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the evidence. Then he looked up and addressed Jordan directly. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly, "you've presented compelling evidence, but presenting is only part of the process. Understanding the implications is another." Jordan nodded. "I understand, Your Honor. Please, ask your questions." The judge began. "You claim the notice is invalid due to fraud. Under what statute or precedent do you base this?" Without missing a beat, Jordan replied, "Section 58 of the State Tenant Protection Act, which requires that eviction notices be notarized by a certified notary at the time of issue. If not, the notice is void. This is supported by State v. Harper, 2008. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. He continued, "What about the landlord's claim that procedural errors don't matter if rent was unpaid?" Jordan answered confidently, "That's addressed in Franklin v. Rhodes, 2011. The court ruled that proper legal procedure is non-negotiable. Regardless of rent status, a fraudulent notice invalidates the process entirely." The judge's tone shifted again, this time with deeper weight. "Are you aware that if your argument is upheld, it could set a precedent that reshapes landlord-tenant disputes across the state?" Jordan didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor, but the law should apply equally to everyone. If loopholes allow injustice, then we must close them. Landlords must follow the law, just like tenants." For a long moment, Judge Reynolds tapped his pen thoughtfully, then looked back at Jordan. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "I've seen seasoned lawyers falter under pressure, but you've shown preparation, clarity, and understanding that rivals professionals. It's remarkable." Silence fell. Even the soft hum of the ceiling lights felt louder. No one laughed now. No one scoffed. The same crowd that once dismissed Jordan now watched him with silent admiration. The judge leaned back, and though his expression remained stern, his eyes had softened, just slightly, with respect. Jordan Carter stood at the defense table, binder open before him, his heart pounding but his voice steady, dressed in his oversized blazer and gripping the edge of the table. He stared down the courtroom that had laughed at him days earlier. Now, the air was still, heavy with anticipation. "Your Honor," he began, his tone firm, "I am here to prove that my family's eviction was not only unjust but also in violation of the law." As he continued, laying out the timeline, his words came more naturally, each sentence drawing from nights of relentless study. The courtroom, once dismissive, began to lean in, listening. Franklin Moore, the opposing attorney with his crisp suit and confident sneer, interrupted with a smirk audible in his voice, ridiculing Jordan's inexperience with jabs about YouTube and Google. The room chuckled, but Jordan stood firm. "I didn't learn this from YouTube," he said calmly. "I learned it by studying the same laws that are supposed to protect us all." Moore's smirk twitched. The judge leaned forward, interest peaked. Jordan opened his binder and walked the court through the events step by step, the eviction notice, the dates, the requirements, and finally, the revelation. The notary who had supposedly signed the document had retired 2 years before it was issued. He presented the facts methodically, linking the evidence to the legal violations, showing not only his understanding of the law but his command over it. The audience began to shift. Even those who had mocked him now watched with quiet respect. But Moore wasn't ready to concede. Rising from his seat, he moved with polished confidence, flipping open a law book and reading aloud with theatrical flair. He cited Section 45 of the Landlord-Tenant Act, stating a landlord has the right to evict if rent hasn't been paid for 2 consecutive months. "Are you denying your mother was behind on payments?" Moore challenged, trying to trap Jordan in a legal corner. Jordan didn't hesitate. "I'm not here to deny the delays," he responded, "but I am here to prove that the eviction notice itself is invalid due to fraud, making the entire process unlawful." Holding up the notice for all to see, he pointed again to the notary's signature, clear, indisputable proof of misconduct. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Moore glanced at the paper, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. Still, he pushed back, invoking Section 52 of the same Act, claiming that procedural errors don't invalidate an eviction if the tenant failed to pay. Jordan responded instantly, acknowledging the clause but clarifying that such leniency only applies if the notice was valid in the first place. "This is not a clerical error," he explained. "This is a fraudulent document. And under state law, that voids the eviction entirely." For a long moment, the room held its breath. Moore's posture stiffened as he returned to his seat, defeated but unwilling to show it. The judge, who had watched the entire exchange with growing intrigue, finally leaned forward. His tone was more serious now, more curious. "Mr. Carter," he began, "these are serious accusations. If this evidence is verified, it could fundamentally alter this case." With a swift bang of the gavel, Judge Reynolds called for a brief recess to authenticate the documents. As he exited the courtroom, the tension shifted. Jordan let out a breath, shoulders relaxing slightly. He turned and caught his mother's eye. Angela sat behind him, tears glistening, her expression filled with pride and relief. She gave him a subtle nod, her silent way of saying, "I see you." In that moment, Jordan felt something new, not fear, not pressure, but validation. Everything he had studied, all the late nights and quiet tears, had led to this moment of recognition. The judge returned after the break, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the evidence. Then he looked up and addressed Jordan directly. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly, "you've presented compelling evidence, but presenting is only part of the process. Understanding the implications is another." Jordan nodded. "I understand, Your Honor. Please, ask your questions." The judge began. "You claim the notice is invalid due to fraud. Under what statute or precedent do you base this?" Without missing a beat, Jordan replied, "Section 58 of the State Tenant Protection Act, which requires that eviction notices be notarized by a certified notary at the time of issue. If not, the notice is void. This is supported by State v. Harper, 2008. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. He continued, "What about the landlord's claim that procedural errors don't matter if rent was unpaid?" Jordan answered confidently, "That's addressed in Franklin v. Rhodes, 2011. The court ruled that proper legal procedure is non-negotiable. Regardless of rent status, a fraudulent notice invalidates the process entirely." The judge's tone shifted again, this time with deeper weight. "Are you aware that if your argument is upheld, it could set a precedent that reshapes landlord-tenant disputes across the state?" Jordan didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor, but the law should apply equally to everyone. If loopholes allow injustice, then we must close them. Landlords must follow the law, just like tenants." For a long moment, Judge Reynolds tapped his pen thoughtfully, then looked back at Jordan. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "I've seen seasoned lawyers falter under pressure, but you've shown preparation, clarity, and understanding that rivals professionals. It's remarkable." Silence fell. Even the soft hum of the ceiling lights felt louder. No one laughed now. No one scoffed. The same crowd that once dismissed Jordan now watched him with silent admiration. The judge leaned back, and though his expression remained stern, his eyes had softened, just slightly, with respect. The courtroom was silent, holding its breath as Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, the tap of his pen against the desk the only sound that dared disturb the tension. For the first time since the hearing began, the judge's expression shifted from stoic skepticism to quiet admiration. His gaze softened slightly as he studied the young man before him, not as a confused teenager, not as a courtroom oddity, but as a figure of courage and conviction. "Mr. Carter," he said clearly, his voice resonating through the still air, "you've presented your arguments with clarity, precision, and a remarkable grasp of the law. I'll admit, when you first walked into this courtroom, I underestimated you, but today, you've reminded us all of a fundamental truth. Justice doesn't discriminate, not by age, not by race, not by background. It's driven by truth and by courage. And you have shown both. The room, once filled with quiet laughter and dismissive whispers, now sat in stunned silence. Heads nodded in agreement, and a murmur of newfound respect rippled through the gallery. A man seated in the second row, who had chuckled earlier, now leaned forward with furrowed brows and whispered to the person beside him. "Maybe I misjudged him." An elderly woman dabbed at the corner of her eye with a handkerchief, whispering softly, "That boy has more integrity than most grown men I've ever met." The energy in the room shifted from mockery to reverence. Even Franklin Moore, the once smug attorney, sat stiffly in his seat, his lips tight, eyes lowered, as if the weight of his own arrogance had just settled on his shoulders. His fingers were laced together, knuckles white, his earlier condescension now replaced with something closer to reluctant respect. Jordan Carter stood at the defense table, his hands resting on the edge of his binder, his posture straight, composed, and dignified. The storm of judgment he had weathered was no longer bearing down on him, it was behind him. After months of relentless effort, sleepless nights, and being doubted by everyone around him, he was finally being seen not as a child, but as a capable, determined force. He turned to glance at his mother. Angela Carter sat quietly a few rows back, her hands clasped tightly, tears shining in her eyes. She gave him a subtle nod, a silent message filled with pride, gratitude, and unwavering love. Her son had not only defended her, he had changed the hearts of everyone in that courtroom. Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, eyes still locked on Jordan. "You've taught us something today, Mr. Carter, not just about the law, but about resilience and integrity. Your work here is extraordinary. I hope this is only the beginning of your journey." Jordan met his eyes and replied with humility, "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll carry this lesson with me." A faint smile tugged at the corners of the judge's lips. "You've earned this victory, son, and I suspect you'll earn many more." With that, he lifted the gavel and delivered the final judgment with clarity and force. The court rules in favor of the defendant, Angela Carter. The eviction notice is hereby declared invalid. The plaintiff is ordered to compensate the Carter family for wrongful eviction and emotional distress. For a moment, the room was frozen in stunned silence. Then scattered applause broke out. Cautious at first, then louder, filled with emotion. Angela gasped, covering her face as tears streamed freely. She rose from her seat and rushed toward Jordan, throwing her arms around him with a force that almost knocked the binder from his hands. "You did it," she whispered through trembling lips. "You really did it. You're my pride, my hope, my everything." Jordan hugged her back tightly, his own eyes misty but calm. "We did it, Mom," he said softly. "This victory is ours." As the gallery slowly emptied, people stopped to glance at him, some nodding respectfully, others offering quiet words of encouragement. But one figure remained. Judge Reynolds stepped down from the bench and approached them, his expression solemn but thoughtful. Extending a hand, he looked directly at Jordan. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I owe you an apology." Jordan blinked in surprise but shook his hand firmly. The judge continued, "When you first entered this courtroom, I assumed you didn't belong here. I let my own assumptions and biases cloud my judgment. But today, you've reminded me, and all of us, that the law belongs to everyone. You've displayed truth and courage in remarkable ways." Jordan nodded slowly. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot to me." Reynolds placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have a rare gift, son. If you're serious about law, I'd be honored to mentor you. This field needs voices like yours." Angela pressed her hand to her chest, overwhelmed, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, barely able to speak. And with that, Jordan and Angela walked out of the courthouse, the bright midday sun washing over them, warming their faces, lifting the weight that had hung over them for so long. The air felt different, cleaner, freer. Jordan paused at the top of the courthouse steps, eyes fixed on the clear blue sky. "One day," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, "I'll come back, not as a defendant, but as a lawyer. I'll fight for people like us." Angela turned to him, her voice strong despite her tear-streaked cheeks. "You will," she said. "I know you will." They walked home together, steps lighter than they'd been in months. The small house they fought so hard to protect stood waiting, its door open, as if ready to welcome them back. Jordan glanced back one last time at the courthouse. His face calm, resolute. This wasn't the end of his fight, it was just the beginning. And somewhere deep inside him, he knew he would return, not because he had to, but because he was meant to. As Jordan and Angela stepped through the door of their modest home, the one they had nearly lost, a quiet peace settled over them like a warm blanket. The light streamed through the windows, catching specks of dust that danced slowly in the air. But it felt like golden confetti, a silent celebration of a battle hard fought and deeply won. The walls, though still chipped and faded, no longer looked tired, they looked proud, like they had stood witness to a miracle. Jordan placed his binder gently on the table, the same table where it had all begun, the same table where he had stayed up night after night, determined to understand a world that wasn't built for people like him. Angela moved into the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the overwhelming relief that came when the storm finally passed. "It's over," she whispered, almost as if she needed to hear it out loud to believe it. But Jordan, standing in the middle of the living room, shook his head softly. "No, Mom," he said, his voice low but filled with new strength. "It's just beginning." The weight of those words lingered in the air, not as a burden but as a promise, a quiet declaration that what they had just done would ripple beyond their little home, beyond their street, beyond even their city. For Jordan, this wasn't just about protecting their roof or proving he could outsmart a lawyer. It was about lighting a spark in the dark corners where people had stopped believing they could fight back. In the days that followed, the story spread, first in whispers among neighbors, then in news clips, then across social media where people shared it with words like inspiring, unbelievable, heroic. Journalists called, community leaders reached out, and strangers from across the country sent letters addressed simply to the boy who defended his mom. But Jordan didn't let the attention distract him. Instead of soaking in praise, he spent his time learning more, reading deeper, asking questions about the law and the rights of those who rarely had the chance to use it. He understood something now, something that couldn't be unlearned. Knowledge was power, but only when wielded with purpose. One evening, as he sat again at the kitchen table, flipping through a book on civil rights law he had borrowed from the community library, Angela joined him with 2 cups of tea and placed one gently beside him. "You haven't stopped since the case ended," she said with a soft smile. "You don't have to prove anything anymore." Jordan looked up at her, his eyes older now, wiser, filled with something that couldn't be taught in schools. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he replied. "I'm trying to be ready. Because there are other people out there who need help, and they don't know where to start." Angela nodded slowly, her heart swelling with pride. He was no longer just her son. He had become something more, someone who could lead, someone who could protect, someone who could make real change. Meanwhile, Judge Reynolds kept his word. A few weeks after the trial, Jordan received a formal letter inviting him to visit the courthouse chambers. There, over coffee and law books, the judge began mentoring him, introducing him to legal reasoning, case study analysis, and the art of structured argument. Jordan absorbed it all like sunlight, grateful, eager, determined. He asked questions that surprised even the judge. And when they parted that day, Reynolds looked at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for bright young lawyers at the start of their careers. "You have the fire," he said simply. "What you choose to do with it is up to you. But don't let it burn out." Jordan nodded, those words engraving themselves in his memory. Months passed, and while life returned to a new kind of normal, nothing was quite the same. The house felt warmer, the days felt lighter, even the neighborhood, once weighed down by struggle and silence, seemed to carry a bit more hope. Kids who used to walk by with slouched shoulders now waved at Jordan, calling him the lawyer kid. Parents asked him to explain tenant rights, and community centers invited him to speak to youth groups about resilience. justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Jordan never bragged. He never raised his voice. But when he spoke, people listened, not because of his age or fame, but because of the truth in his eyes. And while he still wore that same oversized blazer from time to time, it no longer looked too big. Somehow, he had grown into it, not in size, but in purpose. He understood that the real victory wasn't just winning the case. It was breaking the belief that they were powerless. One quiet night, long after Angela had gone to bed, Jordan stepped out onto the front porch. The sky stretched wide above him, dotted with stars. He sat on the steps, staring at the world around him, the place that had tried to push him down and yet had become the foundation of his rise. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, and whispered into the night, "I'll come back to that courtroom someday, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong there." And in the stillness of that moment, the world seemed to answer, not with words, but with quiet affirmation. Jordan Carter had taken his first step toward a future no one saw coming. And he wasn't walking alone anymore. He was walking for all of them. The months that followed Jordan's courtroom triumph felt like a second awakening. Not just for him and his mother, but for an entire community that had grown used to losing quietly. The story of the teenager who had defended his mother and exposed a fraudulent eviction system didn't just make headlines. It became a spark that ignited conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and council meetings. People began asking questions, questioning assumptions, and demanding answers from landlords and legal officials who had once acted with impunity. Jordan, still only 17, found himself suddenly at the center of something much larger than himself. Yet, despite the attention, he remained grounded. Fame didn't faze him. He wasn't chasing applause or validation. What drove him now was the realization that justice was fragile, and too many people were denied it simply because they lacked the knowledge, confidence, or support to fight back. That fire, the one that lit the moment he saw his mother's hands shaking over an eviction notice, was still burning inside him. Only now it had direction. Each day after school, he would spend hours at the local library or in Judge Reynolds' chambers, continuing to read law texts and court rulings with the same hunger he had shown in preparing for their case. His notebooks piled high, filled with outlines, definitions, and case examples. He had become a student of justice, not just its language, but its spirit. People in the neighborhood started calling him not just the kid who won, but the boy who gives people hope. He would stop and speak to elderly tenants facing rent hikes or single mothers unsure of their rights. He listened, he researched, and he explained things in a way they could understand. Jordan wasn't a lawyer, not yet, but he was already acting like an advocate. One afternoon, a local community center invited him to speak at a town hall about tenant protections. Jordan, in his same oversized blazer, stood before a room packed with skeptical adults and nervous families. He didn't raise his voice or wave his arms. He simply told them his story. The fear, the doubt, the nights he sat up studying alone, the moment he uncovered the fraudulent notary signature, and the day he faced a courtroom full of doubters and won. His words weren't rehearsed, but they were true, and that truth had power. By the end of his talk, people weren't just clapping. They were standing. Afterward, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes and said, "I thought people like us had no voice. But now I see, we just need to find the courage to use it." That one sentence stuck with Jordan more than any headline ever could. Around this time, the local high school invited Jordan to mentor younger students, and he began tutoring kids not just in English or history, but in how to think critically, how to ask questions, and how to believe in their right to be heard. He taught them what no classroom ever had, that justice is something you don't wait for, it's something you fight for. One evening, as he returned home from a workshop, Angela was waiting for him with a small envelope in her hands. Inside was a scholarship offer, one he hadn't even applied for, sent by a private foundation that had learned about his story. The letter offered full tuition for a pre-law program at a nearby university once he graduated high school. Jordan read the letter silently, heart thudding, then looked up at his mom. She was crying, laughing, and hugging him all at once. "You did this," she whispered. "You made them see you. You made them see us." He hugged her back, but his mind was already thinking ahead. Not about the glory, not about the scholarship, but about what it meant. It meant doors were opening. And if doors were opening for him, he had to hold them open for others. The following weekend, Jordan and Angela visited the courthouse together, not for a case, but for a meeting. Judge Reynolds had invited them for lunch, and over sandwiches in his office, he talked to Jordan about the path to law school, internships, and advocacy. "You're not just bright," the judge told him. "You're principled. That's rare. Stay that way." Jordan nodded. He knew that no matter where he went, he would never forget where he came from, or why he started. Later that night, Jordan sat again at the kitchen table, flipping through a book of state law, highlighter in hand, as Angela quietly prepared dinner. The smell of simmering stew filled the air. And outside, the wind rustled through the neighborhood trees. It was peaceful, but beneath that peace, a purpose continued to grow. He wasn't fighting to prove himself anymore. He was preparing to fight for everyone who felt powerless. At one point, Angela looked over and said softly, "You're going to change the world, aren't you?" Jordan looked up from the page. Eyes steady. "I'm going to try," he said, and somehow, with those 4 simple words, the entire house felt like it had grown bigger, as if it was no longer just a home, but the first stepping stone on a journey that was just beginning. The courtroom may have been the place where Jordan Carter first found his voice. But now, the world was the place where he intended to use it. As weeks turned into months, Jordan Carter's name continued to echo far beyond the courtroom that had once dismissed him as a boy out of place. What had started as a desperate fight to save his mother's home had grown into something far greater, a movement built on the belief that ordinary people, when armed with truth and determination, could stand tall against injustice. Jordan's story spread not as a viral spectacle, but as a quiet revolution whispered in school hallways, discussed in town halls, and passed from neighbor to neighbor like a sacred truth. People began to see him not only as a courageous teenager but as a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to back down. Invitations came in waves. Schools wanted him to speak. Advocacy groups asked him to attend panels. And even local officials wanted to hear his thoughts on reforming tenant law. But Jordan never let the spotlight distract him. He had learned early that fame fades, but purpose stays. Instead of chasing attention, he focused on sharpening his skills, deepening his knowledge, and offering his voice to those who hadn't yet found theirs. One Saturday morning, as the sun filtered through the worn blinds of their kitchen, Jordan and Angela sat with coffee mugs in hand, surrounded by papers, printouts, and letters from families across the country. Some had been evicted unjustly. Others were on the brink of losing everything. Many simply wrote to say thank you. Angela wiped a tear as she read one letter aloud from a single mother in Detroit who had used Jordan's story to fight her own eviction and win. "You gave me the strength," the woman wrote, "to believe I had a chance." Jordan said nothing at first, staring at the letter as if trying to feel every word. Then he looked up at his mom and said, "I think it's time I do more." And so, with the help of Judge Reynolds and a few passionate volunteers, Jordan launched a community initiative called the Carter Project. Its mission was simple but profound: provide free legal education and support to families facing eviction and housing injustice. He wasn't a lawyer yet, and he never pretended to be, but he knew how to connect people with resources, to simplify legal terms, to give them the confidence to ask the right questions. The Carter Project began in a single room at the community center with donated furniture and handwritten posters. It wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. Dozens came in those first few weeks. Then hundreds. People walked in afraid and walked out informed. And in every workshop, every counseling session, Jordan made sure they knew that what had happened to him wasn't magic, it was work. fueled by love, and within their reach too. As the project grew, so did Jordan's circle. Law students from nearby universities asked to intern with him. Retired attorneys offered to volunteer. Even a few landlords came, curious to learn and, surprisingly, to listen. Jordan welcomed them all. Change doesn't come from shaming people, he told his team one day. It comes from helping them understand what's right. Despite his growing schedule, Jordan never let go of his own dreams. He continued studying for college entrance exams, reading legal theory late into the night, often falling asleep with a book still open on his chest. He met regularly with Judge Reynolds, who became both mentor and friend, guiding him through everything from legal precedent to courtroom ethics. One afternoon, during a walk in the park, the judge turned to him and said, "You remind me of myself when I was younger, but you've already gone further than I had at your age. Just promise me one thing, Jordan, never let the law become about ego. Keep it about people." Jordan nodded. "I promise." At home, Angela transformed their living room into a space of both warmth and purpose. Where there were once family photos, there were now also whiteboards with ideas for the Carter Project's next outreach event. But no matter how busy things got, they always found time for dinner together, even if it was takeout shared over open textbooks. Their bond had deepened through the struggle, becoming something unbreakable, rooted not just in love, but in shared purpose. On the anniversary of their courtroom victory, Jordan organized a community celebration, not to honor himself, but to recognize every tenant who had stood up since. They held it at the same community center where the Carter Project was born. There were no suits or speeches, just food, music, laughter, and stories from families who had fought and won. Jordan stood quietly in the back, watching kids run around, watching adults share smiles that had once been so rare. Angela stood beside him, gently nudging his arm. "Look what you started," she whispered. Jordan shook his head. "Look what we started." As the evening ended, an elderly man approached him, a former tenant who had nearly been homeless. He handed Jordan a folded piece of paper. "I know you're still in high school," the man said, "but when you become a lawyer, I want you to be mine." Jordan laughed, but something about the way the man said it stayed with him. Later that night, as he sat alone on the porch, the stars scattered above like silent witnesses, Jordan reflected on the journey. He thought of that first night at the kitchen table, the eviction notice clutched in his hands. He thought of the judge's skeptical gaze, of Moore's ridicule, of every moment he could have quit but didn't. He understood now that justice wasn't a destination, it was a lifelong road. Some days it was paved with applause. Other days, it was lined with silence and setbacks. But no matter the terrain, he would keep walking, because if he didn't, who would? As Jordan Carter's name quietly made its way into more homes and hearts, his impact deepened not just through the victories he helped others achieve, but through the belief he restored in people who had nearly given up. He didn't wear a cape, carry a degree, or hold a badge, but to many, especially in struggling neighborhoods, he was a symbol of something long forgotten, hope with direction. He had shown him that justice wasn't reserved for the elite or the privileged. And that with enough courage, knowledge, and conviction, even a 17-year-old boy in an ill-fitting blazer could outmatch the odds. And yet, Jordan never let the admiration inflate his ego. To him, every thank you was a reminder of responsibility, every hug another silent vow to keep fighting. He worked even harder, his days now filled with community workshops, tenant education programs, and mentorship sessions with younger students who saw in him a future they once thought impossible. Though he was still technically in high school, Jordan's routine mirrored that of a full-time advocate. Mornings began with classes, afternoons with project meetings, evenings with study sessions, and late nights still found him reading legal texts. His binder now filled not just with notes but with plans for change, for scale, for something permanent. The Carter Project had outgrown its single-room setup and now operated in 3 community centers across the city. Staffed by volunteers, supervised by law students, and energized by the people it served. It wasn't a charity, it was a movement. But behind every achievement, there were quiet sacrifices. Jordan rarely joined parties, skipped sports, and missed out on much of the carefree joy that teenagers usually experienced. Angela worried sometimes, watching him grow older, faster than most, but she also knew there was no stopping someone walking in their purpose. "Are you okay?" she asked him one night as he quietly typed up a new eviction prevention guide for single mothers. He paused, smiled, and said, "I'm not tired, I'm driven." And she believed him. Still, she reminded him that even warriors need rest. So sometimes, on Sundays, they would go for long walks, no papers, no projects, just laughter and shared memories. It was during one of those walks that Jordan noticed a young boy sitting alone on the front steps of a rundown apartment complex. The boy looked frustrated, a book clutched in his hands, pages wrinkled as if from repeated flipping. Jordan stopped, knelt beside him, and asked what he was reading. "Don't know," the boy muttered. "It doesn't make sense." Jordan smiled, took a quick look, and realized it was a pamphlet about tenant rights, one of the ones from the Carter Project. The boy had picked it up, trying to understand what his mother was going through. Jordan sat with him for 20 minutes, explaining each part, not as a lecture but as a story. When he was done, the boy nodded slowly and said, "So we don't have to move just because the landlord says so?" Jordan replied, "Not if the law is on your side. And now you know how to check." It was in these quiet, unpublicized moments that Jordan found his truest joy. He wasn't building a brand, he was building awareness. As the school year edged closer to graduation, Jordan received college acceptance letters, some from top-tier universities, many offering full scholarships in pre-law and political science. Yet he remained undecided, not because he didn't want to go, but because he feared stepping away from the people who needed him most. "What if everything falls apart while I'm gone?" he asked Judge Reynolds during one of their mentoring sessions. The judge leaned back, crossed his arms, and said, "Then build something that won't." Those words lingered, anchoring themselves deep in Jordan's mind. So he gathered his team, volunteers, local leaders, and friends, and began the transition. Not an exit, but a transformation. He created a formal board for the Carter Project, trained new coordinators, and partnered with local law clinics to ensure the initiative could run without him day to day. He wasn't abandoning his roots, he was preparing them to grow without needing him constantly present. And when he finally packed for college, Angela stood beside him, helping fold the same blazer he had worn to court that unforgettable day. She held it a moment longer, looked at him, and said, "You were never too small for this jacket, Jordan. The world just needed to catch up to your size." He laughed, hugged her tight, and promised he would come home often. The day he left, the neighborhood gathered, not for a goodbye, but for a send-off. Kids held handmade signs, elders gave him prayers, and someone even brought a cake shaped like a courthouse. As he stood there, surrounded by the faces he had fought for, Jordan realized this wasn't the end of a story. It was merely the closing of one chapter, the beginning of another. At college, he threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he had once reserved for that first case. Professors were astonished at his insight, classmates drawn to his story. But Jordan remained focused. He wasn't chasing accolades, he was preparing for something bigger, because he knew that when he returned, not just to his neighborhood but to the courtroom, the city, the system, he wouldn't be the boy in the blazer anymore. He'd be the lawyer in the room. And this time, no one would dare ask him if he was lost. Months into his first year of college, Jordan Carter was no longer just a student, he was becoming a symbol. A quiet force whose name carried both weight and warmth. Though his days were now filled with lectures, research papers, and campus events, Jordan never let himself forget where he came from or why he started. While others around him discussed theories and debated court precedents in polished seminar rooms, Jordan approached every topic with lived experience, grounding abstract principles in the reality of what he had seen and fought for. Professors were impressed not only by his insight but by the way he listened, deeply, intentionally, before speaking, and when he did, his words carried the same clarity and conviction that once stunned a courtroom into silence. Yet Jordan didn't let praise distract him. Between classes, he stayed in touch with the Carter Project, joining board meetings over Zoom, reviewing case updates, and mentoring the new volunteers who had stepped in to carry the mission forward. He responded personally to emails from families seeking guidance, offering encouragement or pointing them toward resources, always reminding them, "You're not alone." His dorm room was modest, but its shelves were lined with books on social justice, housing law, and civil rights history, each title worn at the corners from constant use. On his desk sat 2 framed photos, one of him and his mother, smiling outside the courthouse, and another of the kitchen table where it had all begun. Those 2 images, side by side, reminded him daily that great change doesn't come from grand offices or power suits. It comes from love, grit, and the refusal to let people be forgotten. One late night, after finishing a paper on constitutional law, Jordan stepped outside and sat on a campus bench beneath the quiet stars. The air was crisp, the world calm, but his mind was racing, not with anxiety, but with vision. He thought about the boy who once clutched a fraudulent eviction notice and decided to fight. He thought about how far he had come, and how far there still was to go. He didn't just want to be a lawyer anymore. He wanted to reshape the system. From courtroom to Capitol, he wanted to write laws that protected the vulnerable, train others to challenge injustice, and build a future where no family had to face the terror of losing their home without someone to stand beside them. As the night deepened, Jordan looked up at the sky and whispered not a prayer, but a promise, to his mother, to his community, and to himself. "I'm just getting started."